there were 651 murders in England and Wales. What percentage got cleared up?
I'm Professor of Criminology, and I've spent a lifetime working with serious violent offenders. I've written something like 15 books about serial killers and violent crime. And I've been teaching my students this theory, this idea that serial killers are responsible for many more murders than those murders that they get convicted of having committed.
What age group do you think is most likely to be murdered in England and Wales?
This is the first time I'll be able to put some of that theory into practice by going out on the road and meeting people that might be able to direct me so as to demonstrate that that theory is real, that serial killers are responsible for many more crimes than they're currently being banged up for. In 2006, I was personally involved in one of the most notorious serial killer cases in British history. And what I saw in those dark days has stayed with me ever since.
They know a killer is out there. They can't be sure how many times he's struck.
As a criminologist, I was at the heart of the media storm, called on for expert analysis by a major news channel.
My overwhelming impression immediately is that this is somebody who's very confident about what he is doing.
It was the case of Steve Wright, who became known as the Suffolk Strangler when he murdered 5 women who worked as sex workers in a ferocious killing spree that unfolded over just 10 days in December that year.
Nobody, Paul, emerges as suddenly a double murderer. There's a history going on here, and what I would be doing, what this suggests to me, is that I would be looking at some of the previous unsolved murders of young prostitutes in this area to see if those murders are linked as well, because my anxiety is that we've got a serial killer here.
But the sheer pace of the killings that played out under the glare of the world's media meant that my immediate instinct went unchecked at that time. That nagging feeling has stayed with me ever since. So now, I want to see if I can back up my theory that Wright had killed before, with a thorough, modern crime analysis. This case began in the sleepy Suffolk town of Ipswich on the 2nd of December 2006, when the body of a young sex worker was found dead in a brook on the outskirts of the city. Her name was Gemma Adams, and she was just 25 years old. The discovery of a body in a small town was big news, and investigating the case would test police to their limits in one of the smallest and least prepared forces in the country.
In 2006, Suffolk was one of the safest counties in the country, and on average we would only get 6 or 7 murders per year. And in fact, we didn't have a major investigations team, which is how most forces operate now.
To begin my journey, I've come to meet Trevor Saunders, the water bailiff who made a shocking discovery that still haunts him to this day.
Trevor, it's a beautiful day today, but what was weather like in November, December 2006?
On that morning, it was sunny.
Yep.
Warm. Calm.
And that was very different to the kind of...
it was different to 2 weeks beforehand, when it was all in flood and chucking it down with rain every day of the week.
When you're saying it was all in flood, what are we talking about?
The brook had overflowed and flooded onto the banks.
And of course, that was the first good day, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. That was the first day I was able to actually get into the brook. Up until then, I'd have sunk up to my neck.
And what did you find when you went into the brook?
Well, I got along the brook a little ways, suddenly noticed what I thought then was a dummy, or a mannequin in one of these shop window things. Me thinking, well, that's another obstruction, I'll get down and get it out. As I got into the brook and realised that, no, it wasn't a dummy, it was a real body of a young lady.
So it must have been a pretty shocking experience for you.
It was, yeah. Yeah, well, being an ex-army man and seeing dead bodies as well, but that was totally different. Totally different. It took me, well, set me back quite a bit, actually.
Well, we know where Gemma was found, but do you have any idea about where she might have been placed in the river?
Well, my personal point is it'd have put her in the bridge from the main road.
Would you have been able to park at the bridge?
There's a little lay-by on the right-hand side of the road, so you could have parked there.
And that lay-by isn't overlooked by any houses?
No.
And there's no street lighting, of course, either, is there?
No, pitch black. Because at the time, it was completely, like I say, overflowing. So
after you find Gemma's body, what did you do then?
Well, the first thing I'd done was phone the police. It took, what, 10, 15 minutes before the first policeman got there. Within half an hour, all and sundry was there.
In Fenland, outside Ipswich, they're searching for a killer.
Gemma Adams was found face down in this brook. One theory the police are looking into is that her killer might have dumped her body from this small bridge here.
The body was found naked in the water, no clothing, in quite a badly decomposed state. So we didn't know who it was until, in fact, we'd managed to get the body out of the water and we moved to the post-mortem stage at Ipswich Hospital.
Gemma was found with hyperinflated lungs, consistent with asphyxiation. Steve Wright would later become notorious as the Suffolk Strangler.
I'm Glenn Wilson, Professor of Psychology at Gresham College, London.
I wanted to ask one of Britain's top experts in the psychology of sexual deviation what kind of killer we're dealing with, and could he have killed before?
Strangulation is favoured by many serial killers because it gives them a sense of control and domination. It's also a very hands-on form of killing them. They can observe the distress of the victim. That will give pleasure to many sadistic killers. They are effectively playing God. They enjoy the power of life or death over their victim.
Glenn, we don't know how all of his victims died, but we do know that several of them were strangled. Why strangulation?
I'm sure that this was a fetish of Steve Wright, that he got sexual excitement from strangling these victims, and I'm sure that that was his primary motivation in the killing.
The Strangler is intimate with the victim, but Wright could use intimacy in other ways as well, could he not?
He certainly did seem to relate to prostitutes favourably, whereas Sutcliffe was supposed to hate them. It seems to me that Steve Wright was actually sexually excited by these prostitutes. And that seems paradoxical, that he would kill somebody that he was attracted to.
To try and look at cases that would go back 10 or 15 years, one would particularly look at sex workers who had been strangled.
Yes, strangled and deposited away from the point of abduction, perhaps off into the countryside, dumped in ditches and hidden in forests.
Glenn Wilson suggested looking for murders similar to Wright's, and I found another cluster in the nearby city of Norwich. A city where, crucially, Steve Wright used to live and work, and where a notorious red light district still operates to this day. Had any of the women who worked here also fallen victim to Steve Wright? In December 2006, the murders of 5 young women in Ipswich shocked the nation. At the time, I had a hunch the killer, Steve Wright, had struck before, and now I want to back up my theory. In 1988, Steve Wright ran a pub in nearby Norwich called the Ferry Boat Inn, and witnesses say he often returned to the city in the years after he left. So I've come to Norwich's Millennium Library to try and uncover evidence of any crimes here that bear similar hallmarks. What I've discovered was a remarkable number of unsolved disappearances of young women working as prostitutes. But with no killer caught, these cases have gone cold.
Well, you know, it didn't take much investigation to discover that there's a whole sequence
of young women who worked as sex workers who've gone missing in Norwich over the last 12 years. I mean, I'm looking at the case of Michelle Bettles, which I think might be better for us to focus on because Michelle Bettles' body was actually found. So we might be able to get a bit more information in terms of how Michelle Bettles actually died to see if there's a link back to the Ipswich sequence of murders. During Steve Wright's murderous rampage in Ipswich in 2006, when the vulnerability of sex workers was highlighted to the nation, police all but closed down street prostitution in the town. But here in nearby Norwich, women selling sex on the streets is still a problem. To understand how Wright gained such easy access to his victims, I've asked to meet Debbie, who for the last 10 years has run an NHS outreach initiative for street prostitutes called the Matrix Project.
The red light district, if you go back 10 years, was only 3 streets in the centre of Norwich. But now, 10 years on, it's massive. It probably covers, I don't know, 3 or 4 miles.
So how much would it cost to buy a sexual service? I know it would depend on what they were asking for, but what's the economy on the streets?
Because many street sex workers are not only using heroin but crack, cocaine as well, what they will want to do is just get £10 in their pocket. If they can get £10, then they can go into the nearest crack house and use drugs and then come out half an hour later and start all over again.
Have you ever worked with a sex worker who doesn't have an addiction to a Class A drug?
On the streets?
On the street?
Very rarely.
It's almost a one-on-one relationship?
Very rarely. It's probably around 100%, really. Yeah.
What was the red light area of Norwich like in 2006 when awful events started to unfold in Ipswich?
People didn't know how to react, authority didn't know what to do. So we tried to contain the women who were working into a tiny area. Nobody stopped.
Nobody
stopped working.
Debbie introduced me to a woman who used to sell sexual services when Wright frequented the city. She asked not to be identified. What age were you when you first started selling sexual services?
About 15, 16. Obviously, I got a drug habit and then I needed to pay for the drug habit, so I started doing it.
So you were very vulnerable to being attacked, were you not?
Really vulnerable, but that's the price you pay.
Were you attacked?
I've been attacked many times, been held up with knives and beaten up, kidnapped, all sorts of things, but that's the price you pay, isn't it, when you go out there.
It's the price you pay because of what? Because
drug habit.
The drug habit? I always try and explain in relation to murder and serial murder that there are 3 things. There's access and opportunity, and the third thing you need to consider is motivation. And actually, you can ignore motivation if you really concentrate on the first 2 issues, access and opportunity. And sex workers give up access. They give up access because they're prepared to go with the punter in his car to places that are not seen by CCTV cameras or observed by other women selling sexual services. And so they're incredibly vulnerable to attack. Were you still selling sexual services when the 5 women in Ipswich were murdered?
Yeah.
What did that make you think about in relation to what was happening here in Norwich?
It made you a bit on edge, but we still done it, obviously, because we needed the money.
Through her work, Debbie had known personally some of the women I'd come across in my research, as well as some of their clients. Of course, there were echoes of what was happening in Ipswich, in Norwich, because, of course, some young women who sold sexual services on the streets went missing in Norwich in 2000, 2002. Michelle Bettles. Yeah. Did you know those women?
I knew Michelle. I knew Michelle quite well. I'd worked with her for a couple of years, and we saw her out here on a number of occasions. But she came onto the vehicle. She's somebody who was always quite chatty. So it was a real shock.
There's an echo, is there not, in terms of how Michelle was found? She was stripped naked, she was strangled. Is that something that struck you?
Yes, it did.
Did you know Steve Wright by any chance?
I met Steve Wright once. He was dressed as a woman when I met him. It was in this area. In fact, it was on this road.
He was dressed as a woman?
He was dressed as a woman.
What was he wearing?
He had a wig on, he had a dress on, and he had high heels on, and he had makeup on.
Did you speak to him?
Only to say hello. He was introduced to me by another woman, a sex worker, and he was going into a telephone box.
In your experience, do many of their punters dress up as women?
In my experience, not often, but it does happen on occasion.
Occasionally?
Yes, occasionally.
Talking with Debbie's been really helpful, and then she gave this incredible first-hand account that Steve Wright cross-dressed. And so that's also a nice piece of information, I think, to factor in to this jigsaw as I continue on my journey. From my interviews, I now know that Steve Wright often used prostitutes in Norwich and was well known and trusted by them. This would give him access to victims and perhaps also the opportunity to kill them. But Suffolk police didn't have the luxury of time to check on this back in 2006, when a second body was discovered in strikingly similar circumstances to the first. They found themselves in the middle of a rapidly evolving crime story.
The naked body of a woman found in this shallow brook yesterday makes her the second prostitute in a week to be found dead.
After about 5 days, they found another body of a naked female, and this body was held up in a dam. I mean, this was unprecedented. Both sex workers, white females, went missing from similar area, and they're both found naked, dead in Belstead Brook.
To understand how crime scene investigators deal with bodies, I've asked Helen Pepper, senior lecturer in policing at Teesside University, to explain. To help her understand, she often mocks up crime scenes using medical dummies.
So, Helen, here we are in a mocked-up scene, very similar to the first two cases in the Suffolk sequence of murders. There are some real problems if you've got bodies in water of this kind, are there not?
Yes, well, the first challenge is the fact that the body's actually in the water and needs to be recovered from the water. If the body's totally immersed, the first problem that you have is how to recover it and get it out of the water whilst losing as little evidence as possible. The water itself washes the body, and a lot of the forensic evidence will be lost. When I first look at the body, I'm going to look for obvious causes of death. Is there a knife sticking out of the body? Is there a rope tied tightly around the neck? Also, the positioning of the body can be really important. Is it a natural position? Have they fallen that way? Does it look as if it's been placed there?
Helen, how unusual is it to find a body naked in water in these circumstances?
I would say extremely unusual. I never came across it in my career as a crime scene investigator.
As a crime scene investigator, how many cases have you worked on?
About 15,000 cases.
And how many murders?
Probably about 30, 35 murders.
And how many examples like this have you had to deal with when you're investigating murder?
I've never dealt with a case like this.
Not one?
Not one single case.
So this is a really unique MO that we're describing here, isn't it?
Yes, very much so.
So does it surprise you that the police weren't able to gather any forensic evidence from a crime scene such as this?
It doesn't surprise me at all. I think in a situation like this, anything that you do recover is a bonus.
Let me ask you another question. If you were to discover two bodies, naked, placed in water, in a sequence of murders, what would that imply to you as a forensic scientist about the likely perpetrator?
It would make me think that he was forensically aware. It would also make me think that he's quite experienced, that he's worked his way up to it, thinking through how he's going to dispose of the bodies, and, you know, he's probably done other similar things before.
Helen confirmed the hunch I had back in 2006, that whoever murdered the 2 women found in water had killed before. But the discovery of a 3rd body just days later would change everything.
Police today removed a woman's body from the wooded area where it was found. A motorist had spotted the naked corpse yesterday afternoon in Nacton, near Ipswich.
The body was that of missing 24-year-old Annalie Alderton. As police came to terms with the fact that there was a serial killer on the loose, his killing technique was evolving.
I conferred with the crime scene officers who'd videoed and photographed, and they showed me a picture of who we now know is Annalie. At that time, we didn't know who this was, and she was lying on her back in a what I would have thought at the time was quite a strange position.
To get a clear picture of exactly how Steve Wright's modus operandi was developing, I asked Roy to show me the scene where Annalie Alderton was found.
So this is the area where Annalie was found.
Why do you think he chose Nacton?
You know, local knowledge, I think, played a big part in where he, in fact, you know, deposited all the victims, really. And when we found Annalie, she was in this sort of area here.
Was there any marks on her body to suggest she'd been dragged through this brush, or did it look like she'd been carried? No,
there was certainly nothing to suggest she'd been dragged. In fact, one of the strange things was she was really clean.
And what about the body itself? How was it positioned?
Annalie was posed, definitely posed, on her back in like a cruciform sort of position.
So this was very conscious behaviour. He's not just dumped her, he's placed her here.
No, very conscious, and showing, I think, that he spent some sort of time with her, laying her out almost.
Why do you think he posed the body?
I think it's like showing off his behaviour. Now, whether he committed these sorts of offences before, but it would be very unusual, exceptional for somebody to go straight from no offending to murdering people and posing them. I think there's every likelihood he's probably done something else in the past.
But police had no time to look at the past, as every resource they had was involved in the case unfolding before their eyes, and the horrific discovery of yet more bodies was about to stretch them to breaking point.
The worst fears of Suffolk police became reality this afternoon with the discovery of 2 more women's bodies.
Steve Wright became known as the Suffolk Strangler after he brutally murdered 5 women working as prostitutes in Ipswich back in 2006. As a local, he actually lived in the heart of the town's red light district and was well known to many of the girls. Yet during his terrible killing spree, drug-dependent and desperate sex workers continued to ignore the police's warnings to stay off the streets. To find out who these girls were, I've returned to Ipswich to meet Jade, a recovering drug addict who now helps others overcome their addictions. She was selling sexual services in Ipswich in 2006.
Jade, can you remember your first client?
Yeah, it was Steve Wright, was my first client. I was walking up London Road. I just walked past him twice, and he just came over and asked me, was I working? I subsequently said, yeah, I am. And I took him to Riverside, just a couple of minutes from his home, and...
So that's literally just up there?
Literally, yeah. The river is literally just around the corner from his house, about a 2-minute walk across the road from his house.
Did he become a regular client?
No, he wasn't a regular client to me. I think I'd seen him maybe twice, maybe 3 times.
When you saw his face connected to the murders in Ipswich, how did you feel?
I think my guts hit my throat, to be honest, because you don't forget your first client.
Would you tell other women selling sexual services to watch out for people if there was
definitely,
something...
yeah. We all kind of looked out for each other.
I wonder if I can just talk to you a wee bit more about those kinds of issues for a second. And Jade, where would business take place? Was it around here or elsewhere?
Sometimes it was around here, but business would also take place, Copdock Mill, up the Beagle, up the road, industrial estates along Hagley Road. You'd take the time to go that 10 minutes further because you could get caught around the area, so you would take that time to head out towards Copdock, 10, 15 minutes up the road to have the privacy to be able to do what you needed to do without getting caught.
You must be so happy to have left that world behind.
Yeah, I'm loving it. I'm absolutely loving it. Being clean, yeah.
Does that make you think about the 5 women who lost their lives?
Yeah.
You were friends with some of those women,
Yes.
weren't you?
Yeah, I lived in a children's home with Anna Lee Alderton in '99. Went to school with Paula Clennell. You know, had quite a few fun times. And Annette, I had the best sunrise of my life with Annette. One morning, it was a late night, raining. I had money. I had my partner's car, and we didn't want to go to work. I had the money, and me and Annette sat down by the Orwell Bridge. You know, and for that night, we went prostitutes. We were Jade and Annette. We were crying, talking. We really connected.
Tragically, Jade's 2 friends, Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols, were reported missing within hours of the 3rd body being discovered. The police were struggling to contain the situation.
I felt that we were in the middle of something that we didn't know what it was. Was it somebody who was trying to challenge the police? Is it, you know, these bodies being found, were they being put there deliberately? Were the posing of them? Because Annette was posed as well. You know, what were we dealing with? It was almost like a crime in action. And we were trying to get control. Clearly we weren't, but we knew we had to. Somebody was out there killing young women, and we needed to make sure that we stopped it as quickly as possible. I think it was on the 12th of December, so we've got 48 hours from when Anna Lee was found. We're obviously dealing with that. The world's media, I would say, is in Suffolk. And what happened during the afternoon of the 12th of December, a member of the public was walking along the old A14, just at a place called Levington, just up from Nacton. He looks to his right and he sees just off the roadside in the foliage, he sees what he believes is the body of, again, another white, naked female.
But I will need you at some point to go, all right?
We in Suffolk have got a helicopter. The helicopter was put up to go and overfly the scene and start to take video footage. And after about 40 minutes, the helicopter crew reported seeing not only one body, but they'd found another body, which was quite extraordinary.
The worst fears of Suffolk police became reality this afternoon with the discovery of 2 more women's bodies. A member of the public found one corpse near the village of Levington, 5 miles southeast of Ipswich, and within minutes a police helicopter had spotted a second body nearby.
Well, then we were obviously thinking, what is going on here? What is happening now?
I can confirm that this afternoon, Tuesday, December the 12th, 2 bodies have been found near Ipswich. The natural assumption is that these are the 2 missing women, Annette Nichols, aged 29 years, and Paula Clennell, aged 24.
The discovery of 2 bodies so close together seemed to indicate Wright's killing spree was spiralling out of control. I asked DSI Roy Lambert to show me where they were found.
And so this is a memorial to Paula Clennell?
Yes, it is.
Body found about here?
Yeah, Paula was found about here, and Annette was found by the helicopter about 200 metres just down there towards Ipswich.
Again, related to the road where the bodies posed?
Yeah, well, Annette was posed. Paula looked like she'd been dumped and perhaps put down in a hurry, but very near to the road, as you can see, you know, only 10, 12 metres from the road.
You know, a sense what we've been able to do by coming to the sites where the bodies were disposed of is build up a better picture of the kind of killer Steve Wright was. This is somebody who has power. This is somebody who's playing a game with the police, and these are behaviours. The fact that he strips the bodies, he's placed them in water, he's changed his MO slightly, I think partly because he's listening to what's being said in the media. But here we've got a killer who's returning to behaviour that he's exercised in the past.
Finally, forensic science came to the help of the police.
The first bit of good news, if you like, was the results of the DNA, which came on the 17th of December, with regards to us obtaining a DNA profile of somebody who turned out to be the offender, Steve Wright.
DNA evidence from the last 3 victims was entered into the national database. By a stroke of fortune, Wright had been arrested for the theft of £80 from a bar where he worked in 2001, and he'd given a DNA sample at the time. At last, the police had their man.
There was sufficient evidence there to make Steve Wright a suspect, and a plan was put in place to arrest him. We needed to move as quickly and as prudently as we could to make sure he didn't kill anybody else, we did. And he was arrested at just before 5 a.m. on the 19th of December.
It was an early morning call, 5 a.m. to be precise.
He has been arrested on suspicion of murdering all 5 women.
Police sources have described this arrest as highly promising.
Eventually, after Suffolk's largest ever police operation, Steve Wright was arrested on the 19th of December and charged with all 5 Ipswich murders.
Well, he was actually already up. He was going to go to work. I think he was due at work at about 6 a.m. At that time, he was working as a forklift driver for a firm just on the outskirts of Ipswich. So he was arrested. He was surprised by our visit. He's then taken away, where we then started to interview him. Whilst the interviews were going on, then obviously we were then dealing with his house with forensic experts to see if there's any evidence there that can link him with the murders of the girls.
We've got the last girl to go missing with your DNA and the one before with your DNA. Both on their naked bodies. How can that be? No comment.
Like every other serial killer I've studied, Wright has always refused to face up to the crimes he's been arrested for, let alone others that could be linked to him. Despite maintaining his innocence, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But that isn't the end of the story. It's now time for me to take on the most difficult part of my journey. If I'm really going to connect Wright to other victims, I need to know much more about Michelle Bettles, the girl who I discovered had been murdered in Norwich in such similar circumstances. I've asked her father, John, if he'll meet me to tell me about his daughter.
I hadn't got a clue on the lifestyle Michelle had drifted into. If I'd seen that on television and somebody said it, I'd turn around and say, you've got to be joking, you've got to know. No, I didn't. It wasn't till the police came and knocked on my door, and as the investigation progressed, I learnt more about the latter years of her life.
And what do you know of what happened to Michelle? What can you tell me about her murder?
Michelle was last seen, I think it was the 29th or the 30th of March, on the red light district in Norwich. She should have been meeting a client that night, apparently, but the CCTV footage shows Michelle's walking in the wrong direction, and that was the actual last sighting of her alive.
Where was her body found?
Just outside Durham, a lane called Podmore Lane.
What do we know about how Michelle was murdered?
Michelle was strangled, and it wasn't till she'd actually been murdered that sorry.
Take your time, take your time, take your time. Take your time, it's fine.
John's story is heartbreaking, but he's determined to win justice for his daughter. He bravely offered to take me to the actual scene where Michelle's body was discovered. And it was there that I would learn a piece of evidence that could unlock the entire case. After reanalyzing the known crimes of serial killer Steve Wright and comparing them to a strikingly similar case in Norwich, I feel that I'm getting closer to uncovering whether Wright is responsible for murders that predate his notorious Suffolk killing spree. The father of murdered Norwich sex worker Michelle Bettles has offered to show me the site where his daughter's strangled body was left in 2002.
So, John, was this where Michelle's body was found?
Yeah. I say it was a couple of days later when I came across with the police. I didn't find out about Michelle until the 1st of April, which was Bank Holiday Monday.
Can you show me the exact spot where Michelle's body was found?
Yeah, it was just over here where the brambles are all growing.
So this is a very different feel and look to the event back then.
Yeah, this was very barren and the season wasn't so far progressed. There was nothing was growing.
But I'll tell you something that's very constant is water in the background, which has a real echo for me about the Ipswich cases.
John, what's going to give you closure about Michelle's death?
Knowing who did it. Well, nothing will give you full closure, because even if the person was arrested and charged in the next few months, nothing gives you closure to losing a child. You've lost a child for the rest of your life, not just for now.
John, did Michelle ever mention any of her clients to you?
She mentioned one to Denise. At the time, neither of us were aware of the life that Michelle was leading, and she said that she got into a car one night with a cross-dresser.
So this is a man who liked to dress up as a woman?
As a woman. I mean, at the time, we just thought it was an associate or somebody she knew or something along those lines. Never in our minds did we think it was a client, because we hadn't got a clue.
And so, of course, because she's mentioning it to Denise, her mother, is because it's unusual. This was something that didn't regularly happen.
Well, yeah, because, as I say, we were totally unaware of what Michelle had become to become. And it was unusual for her to talk about anybody she met.
Look at this. Look at this. This speaks volumes in relation to what we've been talking about in relation to the signature, the modus operandi, and we also know that Michelle was strangled. And we've got this incredible link that John's been able to provide, that Michelle mentioned a client who cross-dressed. And I know Steve Wright used to cross-dress. This is screaming out connection, connection, connection. One of the rules I teach my students is there's no such thing as coincidence when you're dealing with a serial killer. The journey that we've been on has revealed some quite astonishing and unique pieces of information. In particular, we found out some information which really ties Steve Wright into the abduction and murder of Michelle Bettles. So in terms of the journey ending, I've come back to where I teach in Birmingham City University, and I want to present the evidence that I've discovered to some of the brightest, youngest criminologists in the country. The people that I'm going to be talking to are master's students, PhD students. And not only do they study criminology, several of them work in the criminal justice system as detectives. Thanks very much for coming in. And today I'd like to discuss with you the case of Steve Wright. People might get the impression that somehow if you're presenting to your students that they're simply going to agree with the professor. That's not the case at all. If you've got bright students, they challenge you. For you, when you read the case file, did you come to any kind of conclusions about Michelle Bettles?
Certainly from the facts that are contained within the case files, then yes, I'd certainly be looking at Steve Wright, certainly around the geography, where he was in Norwich and the red light district around there, disposal of the bodies, it all fits very, very neatly.
Interesting. So I hope what I get out of this is either a way to conclude in relation to the argument that I'm making, or they will prompt me to think about other issues I should consider before being able to make a conclusion. The deposition site that Michelle Bettles' body was discovered in, close to water, woodland.
Very similar.
Similar so much so that you want to go, look, this is just extraordinary, or how similar for you?
I'd say significantly similar. Could we have two serial killers operating the same area at the same time with a very similar MO, a similar way of, similar signatures, and I think common sense says it's quite unlikely.
Okay, that's a fair point. One of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence was talking to Michelle Bettles' father. And he pointed out that Michelle was picked up by a man who wore women's clothes. And that seemed to me to just shout Steve Wright. What is that saying to you?
I think this is another way for him to be able to gain that trust with the women as well. Perhaps if he dressed as a woman, they perhaps didn't see it as threatening.
Could, of course, just been a reflection of how deranged, confused and sort of messed up he was.
But that's fine. That's fair enough. We don't need to work out why he is engaging in that behaviour. But how unique is it, Ollie? How unique is that behaviour in a small red light area? Who thinks, in relation to Michelle Bettles, we're looking at a murder committed by Steve Wright? Hands? All of you. All of you. No doubt. I thought the students were really interesting about the Steve Wright case in two respects. Firstly, Steve's argument about deposition sites and how similar the deposition site was in the Michelle Bettel case with the deposition sites in the Ipswich cases. I thought that was really interesting. Secondly, I thought it was Haroon's point, how odd it would be to have two serial killers targeting the same group of people, roughly using the same MO at the same time. That kind of common sense argument is one that I felt was quite persuasive of them. I think, though, I have a responsibility to just allow some of these ideas to develop, to allow my thinking to be concluded on the basis of where the evidence is going to take me.
My journey has revealed a lot of new information to me. In 2006, the way in which the bodies were discovered in Ipswich, particularly the first two found in water, suggested to me that this killer had struck before. Now that I've spoken to one of the lead investigators on the case and a renowned forensic scientist, both confirmed that, in their view, this looked like the work of someone practiced in the art of killing. I've also spoken to former sex workers in both Norwich and Ipswich who said that they had a client who liked dressing as a woman and confirmed it was Steve Wright. I finally made sense of this accusation, which has been made about Wright before, when I visited the site where Michelle Bettles' body was found, and her father revealed that she had talked about getting into a car with a man dressed as a woman. Michelle was selling sexual services in Norwich at a time that Steve Wright was regularly using prostitutes there, and she ended up dead. To me, this is more than a coincidence. In my mind, the application of modern crime theory to this case points in only one direction. As far as my journey about Steve Wright is concerned, it's going to end here outside the Ferry Boat Inn in Norwich. This is a pub he used to run in Norwich in 1988, at the time at the heart of the red light district. The red light district. Steve Wright at the heart of it in Norwich. Of course, very similar to Steve Wright being at the heart of the red light district in Ipswich. And since 2006, I've wanted to look at Wright's life in Norwich to see if there was a similar sequence of disappearances and murders of young women who sold sexual services here. So, you know, if you want a eureka moment, then think about what John Bettles reveals about his daughter Michelle. She picked up a man who liked to cross-dress. We know Steve Wright liked to cross-dress. So as far as I'm concerned, from a criminological perspective, I've come as far as I can go. We've got to convince the police to take seriously the assaults that happen on young sex workers. And if the Norfolk police reopened the Michelle Bettles case, and if they went on the same journey as me, I'm sure their journey would end where mine has, outside the Ferry Boat Inn, looking at Steve Wright as the likely culprit.